America versus Iran. 70 years of tension. For more than 40 years, the United States and Iran have been locked in a dangerous rivalry that has reshaped the Middle East and shaken global politics. From coups and revolutions to nuclear deals and drone strikes, this is not just a story of two countries, it is a story of power, ideology, and survival. In this video, the full story of how America and Iran became enemies, what keeps the tension alive today, and how close the world is to another world war will be explored. Modern U.S.-Iran friction began not with religion or terrorism, but with oil and national pride. In the early 1950s, Iran's elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, tried to nationalize the country's oil industry, which had been dominated by British interests. London and Washington saw this as a threat to Western access to oil and to Cold War stability. So, in 1953, the CIA and British intelligence helped overthrow Mossadegh and restore the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, to full power. For the United States, Iran became a key anti-Soviet ally and a reliable oil supplier. For many Iranians, however, the coup planted a lasting sense of humiliation and the belief that Washington would always interfere in their politics. #, 1979 Revolution and the Hostage Crisis. By the 1970s, the Shah's regime was wealthy and heavily armed, but also authoritarian and increasingly detached from ordinary Iranians. Economic inequality, political repression, and resentment of Western influence helped fuel a broad revolution that united Islamists, leftists, and nationalists. In 1979, the Shah fell, and Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned from exile to establish the Islamic Republic of Iran, promising independence from both East and West. Later that year, Iranian students seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage, demanding the Shah be handed over and condemning decades of U.S. interference. The hostages were held for 444 days, and the United States cut diplomatic ties with Iran, a break that has never been fully repaired. For Americans, the hostage crisis turned Iran into a symbol of anti-American extremism. For Iran's new leaders, confronting the Great Satan became central to their revolutionary identity. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 dramatically altered the political landscape of the Middle East. The overthrow of the Shah and the rise of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini introduced a new Islamic republic that rejected Western influence and sought to export its revolutionary ideals. This sudden transformation alarmed neighboring states, particularly Iraq, where Saddam Hussein feared both the spread of revolutionary fervor and the challenge to his own ambitions. Within a year, tensions erupted into open conflict. In September 1980, Iraq launched a full-scale invasion of Iran, hoping to seize disputed border territories and weaken the new regime before it consolidated power. What Saddam envisioned as a swift campaign instead became one of the longest and bloodiest wars of the late 20th century. The Iran-Iraq War dragged on for 8 years, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives, devastating cities and villages, and leaving deep scars on both societies. The United States, still reeling from the hostage crisis in Tehran and wary of Iran's revolutionary zeal, viewed the conflict through the prism of Cold War geopolitics. Washington feared that Iran's ideology might destabilize pro-Western governments across the region. As a result, the U.S. tilted toward Iraq, providing intelligence and limited material support, while shielding Baghdad diplomatically. This support continued even as Saddam's forces employed chemical weapons against Iranian troops and Kurdish civilians, acts that horrified the world but drew muted responses from Washington, which prioritized containing Iran over condemning Iraq. By the mid-1980s, the war expanded beyond the battlefield into the Persian Gulf. In what became known as the Tanker War, both Iran and Iraq targeted oil tankers and naval vessels, seeking to cripple each other's economies and draw international attention. The Gulf became a perilous theater, where neutral shipping was attacked, mines were laid, and U.S. naval forces were increasingly drawn into direct confrontation. The most tragic incident occurred in July 1988, when the USS Vincennes, a U.S. Navy cruiser, mistakenly shot down Iran Air 655, a civilian Airbus traveling from Bandar Abbas to Dubai. All 290 passengers and crew perished. Although Washington expressed regret and later paid compensation, the disaster deepened Iranian anger and reinforced perceptions of American hostility. By the war ended in August 1988, when both sides, exhausted and unable to secure decisive victory, accepted a United Nations brokered ceasefire. Yet the legacy of the conflict was profound. Iran and Iraq emerged weakened, their economies shattered, and their populations traumatized. For Iran, the memory of U.S. support for Saddam and the tragedy of Flight 655 cemented a narrative of American enmity. For Washington, Iran remained a revolutionary adversary whose influence had to be checked. By the close of the decade, direct combat had ceased, but hostility endured. The United States and Iran increasingly relied on sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and proxy struggles across the Middle East to exert pressure on one another. The Iran-Iraq War thus not only reshaped the balance of power in the region, but also entrenched a pattern of mistrust and confrontation between Tehran and Washington, a dynamic that continues to reverberate in global politics today. After the Cold War, the United States emerged as the unrivaled power in the Middle East. Determined to secure energy supplies and maintain strategic influence, Washington stationed troops across the Gulf and deepened military ties with regional allies. The terrorist attacks of 11 September 2001 marked a turning point, prompting the U.S. invasions of Afghanistan and later Iraq. These interventions reshaped the region, but they also intensified tensions with Iran, whose revolutionary government had long viewed American presence as a threat. Initially, Iran adopted a pragmatic stance. In Afghanistan, Tehran quietly cooperated with the United States against the Taliban, a movement it had opposed for years. Yet this tentative alignment collapsed in 2002 when President George W. Bush denounced Iran as part of an axis of evil. The speech hardened attitudes in Tehran, reinforcing the belief that Washington sought regime change rather than coexistence. Around the same time, revelations surfaced about previously undeclared Iranian nuclear facilities at Natanz and Iraq. These disclosures raised alarm in Washington and among U.S. allies, who feared that Tehran might be pursuing a nuclear weapons capability. Iran insisted its program was peaceful, designed to generate energy and reduce dependence on oil. Nevertheless, the United States and European powers pressed for sanctions and negotiations, aiming to restrict uranium enrichment and strengthen international inspections. In the 2000s, Iran also expanded its support for non-state actors across the region. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shia militias in Iraq, and other networks became instruments of Iranian strategy, tools to deter U.S. and Israeli pressure while projecting influence beyond its borders. For Tehran, these groups represented a defensive shield and a means of asserting regional leadership. Washington, however, saw them as agents of terrorism and destabilization. This clash of perspectives set the stage for a broader struggle, one that would define Middle Eastern politics for decades, a contest between American power and Iranian resistance, fought not only through armies but through sanctions, diplomacy, and proxy conflicts. After years of pressure and secret talks, Iran and 6 world powers, including the United States, agreed to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, known as the JCPOA, in 2015. Under the deal, Iran sharply limited uranium enrichment, reduced its stockpiles, and accepted intrusive inspections in exchange for relief from nuclear-related sanctions. International inspectors repeatedly reported that Iran was complying with the deal's nuclear limits in its early years. However, critics in Washington and the region argued that the JCPOA did not address Iran's ballistic missiles or support for regional militias. In 2018, U.S. President Donald Trump unilaterally withdrew from the agreement and reimposed sweeping sanctions on Iran, calling the deal one of the worst ever signed. About a year later, Iran began breaching JCPOA limits and gradually expanded enrichment levels and stockpiles, escalating nuclear tensions again. With the deal unraveling, Washington launched a maximum pressure campaign, intense sanctions targeting Iran's oil sales, banking sector, and key officials. In response, incidents multiplied in and around the Persian Gulf, including attacks on tankers and the downing of a U.S. surveillance drone, which Washington blamed on Iran. The most dramatic escalation came on 3 January 2020, when the United States killed Qasem Soleimani, the powerful commander of Iran's Quds Force, in a drone strike near Baghdad International Airport. Soleimani had been central to Iran's regional strategy, coordinating militias and operations in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and beyond. Iran retaliated days later by firing ballistic missiles at U.S. bases in Iraq, causing traumatic brain injuries to American troops, but no immediate combat deaths. For a brief moment, the world watched to see whether this would spiral into full-scale war. Today, the United States and Iran remain locked in a low-level confrontation spread across diplomacy, cyberspace, and the wider Middle East. Iran has expanded its nuclear capabilities beyond JCPOA limits, while U.S. sanctions continue to strain Iran's economy and fuel domestic discontent. Both sides also operate through regional partners and proxies, increasing friction in places like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf. Miscalculations, an attack that goes too far, a misread signal, an election result, could trigger a larger crisis with global consequences. Some analysts argue that a renewed nuclear framework and limited de-escalation steps could stabilize the situation, even if deeper mistrust remains. Others warn that as long as Washington sees Iran as a destabilizing force and Tehran sees the U.S. as an existential threat, the rivalry will continue to shape the region's future. The U.S.-Iran conflict is not just about two governments. It affects energy prices, regional wars, global security, and millions of ordinary people caught in the middle. What happens next? Diplomacy, escalation, or another uneasy pause will influence the balance of power in the Middle East for years to come. What do you think? Can this rivalry ever truly end? Or is it destined to flare up again and again? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if videos that break down complex geopolitics into clear stories are appreciated, consider subscribing and turning on notifications for more. If you liked the video, please like, follow, and subscribe. Leave a comment if you want to see more such videos.